Inhabitants of Ulst had a rather terrifying reputation, so they were really afraid. They covered it back up, called the museum in Leiden, who came down the next day, re-uncovered the bucket, enclosed it in plaster, and took it with them to the museum. And I just like showing off this picture because if you look at the top right corner, you can see the wooden shoes of the workers who excavated it, which is a very nice Dutch touch, I always think. A year later, the museum would return to the site to actually excavate it, and they would find that the chieftain's grave of Ulst had actually been buried, had been interred in a Middle Bronze Age barrow, which was already 1,000 years old at the time, and that they had then proceeded to create a new barrow over the top of it, which was over 50 meters in diameter. You can see a very nice cross-section of all the sods that this barrow was made up of. Now, as I said, they enclosed the whole bucket in plaster. They brought it to the museum in Leiden, where all the grave goods that were within the bucket were taken out. Now, at the time, restoration was really just starting to become a science and art. So he was able to sort of piece the bucket together again. We have the sword, which is incomplete, a few pieces of bronze. But what the museum did, which is so exceptional for this period and great for us, is they stored everything else. And they actually have a great entry in the inventory book of number 7.10, which is listed as a clump of rust. But, as would be shown in the 1960s during another restoration episode, that clump of rust contained all the horse tack, it contained an axe, it contained a number of razors and clothing pins. So by preserving that clump of rust, we actually have some of the most important elements from this grave. And then in the 1990s, it was restored again, which led to the sort of shiny complex that we see today. So we actually have a Dutch icon that has been subjected to 3 generations of restorers and 4 generations of archaeologists who have all approached the chieftain's grave differently, very much within the paradigms of the time. And they've all done excellent work. I'm absolutely not trying to say that what was done in the past wasn't done well, because it really was, and it all made my research possible, and my work really stands on the shoulders of giants. But as the 5th generation of archaeologists to really study this grave, I was able to work and bring in over 20 material specialists, which really changed our understanding of all the objects and fragments. And I want to give you a few examples of what we did and how this affected our understanding of this complex. So I want to talk a bit about the chieftain himself, the bronze vessel, the famous sword, and the textiles, which particularly the latter was an entirely new category of find that really wasn't studied before. So in the past, the chieftain himself was viewed as quite an old man, 60-year-old, which is very young, of course, for some of the people in the audience. He was also found to have a problem with his spine called dish, where the ligaments ossify, so you end up with this sort of candle, I think it's called candlestick melt effect, shown here in X-ray, and he was believed to be fat. So that leads to reconstructions like here on the left, where he's really rather not that impressive. However, using new techniques to study the cremation remains, we were able to determine that he is actually a lot younger. He was 30 to 40 years old. And rather than being fat and in a lot of pain, he was actually very strong and muscular, because we were able to identify that the muscle attachments and the ligament attachments were very strongly developed. So this was someone who exercised a lot in his life, so that very much fits with the idea of either a warrior or an equestrian, or at least a very active man. We also found that this condition he has in his spine, dish, is actually does not actually give you any clinical symptoms. The reason it's associated with being old and overweight is because today, dish is only discovered in individuals who have chest x-rays made for another reason. So it's not actually caused by pain in the back that x-rays are done and this condition identified. And statistically, it is senior citizens, and especially people who are overweight, who are x-rayed more frequently. The condition itself would not have caused him any pain. So we've gone from kind of a weak, old, fat chieftain to a man who was in the prime of his life and who would have been very strong and fit. And if we look at the bronze vessel, it used to be viewed as being amateuristically repaired, used up, second-hand item. But it turned out that this understanding actually came from a misinterpretation of a number of elements of the bucket. And I have to say this is in part because the bucket was never available for study for most people in the past, and it was for me, luckily enough. But a lot of the bronze strips that were interpreted as repairs are actually parts of the original handles. They've just broken off during the post-excavation process. So we've gone from this sort of second-hand, hand-me-down bucket to a high-quality item that was imported from the Hallstatt culture that actually has beautiful decorations, and it also incorporates lead, which is at the time quite a rare metal. And the sword as well proved to be a lot more spectacular and complicated than we originally thought, despite it having been the main focus of the grave for almost 90 years. Surprisingly, it was actually never really studied in detail. You couldn't even find drawings of all aspects of this sword. And what we found by going back to all the information we had about these 3 restorations over the past 90 years is that actually the pommel hat, the bit at the very top, is all plaster reconstruction from the 1930s. It is not original, where it was based, or was created by the first restorer based on parallels in the shape of the gold decorations that survive. And even though, to be fair, it's still the main star of the burial, we were able to identify a number of fragments that we found in the depot that hadn't been viewed in 90 years. Originally were also part of the sword decoration. So even though it's spectacular now with gold and bronze decorations, originally it also had lead decorations and inlays of worked bone. And we only were able to identify these by actually going into the depots and really looking and examining every tiny fragment that we found there. You can see here on the bottom right, they're about this big and they've been forgotten for 90 years. But using new techniques such as XRF and use for analysis, we could replace them into the handle of the sword. And a completely forgotten category of finds were the textiles. Even though the restoration in the 1990s had uncovered textiles on a number of the metal artifacts, including the sword blade on the top, the knife, and a number of iron rings, what nobody knew, including the museum, was that in the depots there was actually a drawer of almost like a shoebox lid full of loose textile fragments that the original restorer had removed from the bucket, safely tucked away in our depot, recorded it. It had just never made it into sort of the awareness of the archaeologists studying this grave. And we were able to bring in Carina Grömer and work with the Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency to analyze all these different small fragments of textiles. And we found that we have 8 different kinds of woolen cloth incorporated into this grave, including a number of extremely high quality and complexly created textiles, which in terms of the craftsmanship and the value and time that would have taken to create them, they actually equal the gold inlaid sword. So that completely changed our view of what is important within this grave. And we could also identify by looking at the micro contexts that some of the textiles had been used to wrap grave goods during the funerary ritual, whereas others were put into the vessel as high quality grave goods in their own right. And what happens is that when we use all this new information really from the micro level upwards to reconstruct the burial ritual, we find that we can go from these fragments to more complex connections and then to the actual cinerary urn, because the original restorer left no notes on how things were in the vessel, so we had no information of what the cinerary urn looked like. And what we did is we looked at connections left on the objects. For example, on the top, in the middle block on the top, you see a fragment of corroded iron ring with a little bronze horse tack decoration on it. but it actually has the imprint of the bottom of the bucket on it. So we know that the rings were at the very bottom of the vessel. And then on another piece of iron ring shown on the bottom in the middle, you see pieces of the worked bone and the gold inlays from the sword. So we know that the sword was with its handle down, lying on these iron rings. And by doing that kind of connection over and over, we were able to reconstruct how the cinerary urn was created, which objects were wrapped together, how they were placed in the vessel, and really come to a reconstruction of a very complex and carefully created cinerary urn. So if we take all of this together and look at how we view the chieftain's gravables now, we have gone from an old fat man to a young man in the prime of his life who probably either trained as a warrior or equestrian, or at least did lots of physical hard labor during his life. We see that his burial was a blend of local and exotic customs, and that he was really an elite member of a local society, but one who had international contacts and understood an understanding of Hallstatt culture funerary practice as they are reflected in the burial ritual. We know that his grave goods are actually of extremely high quality. It's just that in the Low Countries we had a funerary rite that involved the deliberate fragmentation and destruction of said grave goods. So even though they don't look as impressive as some of the grave goods found in the Hallstatt culture tombs where you didn't break everything, originally they would have equaled those finds. And the chieftain of Ulster is not the only one. We now have these other two graves found nearby, so he's very much a part of a complex ritual landscape. And admittedly, of course, the chieftain of Gravevold is a very extreme example of this insights that can result from a very detailed analysis of all grave goods from this practice-based perspective, looking at what people did, the choices they made, how they interacted with artifacts. But also shows the value that whether it's intact and exquisite or fragmentary and ugly, they all have information to tell us. And by taking this approach to every single elite grave found in the Low Countries, we were able to establish that actually most of the elite burials, even though they appear different to us, are the result of the local burial practice. The choices made and the actions taken are very similar to every other early Iron Age grave we have. But in a handful of cases, we found that we had graves which had a very exaggerated burial ritual. So there were some differences in the choices made and the actions taken. And what we found is that every single one of these graves that stood out due to the burial ritual contains an element from a wagon or wagon-related horse tack. For example, this grave from Courtin-Etienne has one Jochschnalle in it, and the burial ritual is completely different. So even though they're incorporated into local burial customs, we do see an understanding and an in-depth knowledge of Hallstatt culture funerary customs in these graves. And of course, the first question that this also brings to mind is what role does mobility and the origins of these dead elites play? And that's something that Lisette will tell us tomorrow. Not really, but we're gonna get pretty close, which some new results from isotope analysis. So in conclusion, I just want to say that please don't forget about the ugly and the broken and the rusted pieces of prehistory when you're studying burial contexts, especially ones that have been found in the past, because they really have very exciting things to tell if you take the time to look at them. So this paper is really pleased that you please examine everything, not just the large, beautiful pieces, but all the small fragments that have more to tell us. And that this allows us to go beyond the presence, absence of specific grave types, and that through doing this exercise, you can reconstruct the life histories of objects, of graves, of people. And that this really gives us a solid basis for reconstructing and interpreting all the cultural and social practices that are reflected in burial contexts. Thank you very much.